What is it that makes a great steam locomotive? Is it speed? Is it power? Is it technical sophistication? I'm going to nominate a class of engine that wasn't big or powerful, but lasted in public service for over 90 years. This is the story of the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway's A1 class, or, as they're better known, the Terriers. The Terriers were designed by William Stroudley. Stroudley came to the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway from the Highland Railway in Scotland. Stroudley had trained with the Great Western Railway and the Great Northern Railway, and the Highland Railway was a magnificent company that presented unique engineering challenges. So it must have been quite galling that there was no money available when he was in charge of locomotives. In fact, the only engine he designed there was a small six-wheeled tank engine in 1869. There were only 3 members of this class, 2 of which were built after Stroudley had gone south to Brighton Works. The London, Brighton and South Coast were not a hugely ambitious company. They weren't about big engines and long distances. But they did have a lot of commuter and branch line traffic, and when Stroudley arrived, they were badly in need of an engine that could take care of this. "Hang on, lads," said Stroudley. "I've got a great idea." He took his Highland engine and reworked it for the particular demands of hauling passenger trains around London. Commuter trains around London on the London, Brighton and South Coast at that time were typically around 5 four-wheeled coaches, not necessarily in the best condition. The stations were relatively close together. For commuter trains, acceleration is everything. But the engine also needed to be fairly light so it could be used on any line. The first of his new engines, named Wapping, emerged from Brighton Works in 1872. The cylinders were 13 inches in diameter and the boiler had a heating area of 518 square feet, and a pressure of 140 pounds, or the equivalent in metric. It was built with slotted frames, which reduced the weight, but it was an 060, which meant that all the weight there was on the driving wheels. This is all very technical, but what this translated to in layman's terms was an engine with an excellent power-to-weight ratio. It had a top speed of 60 miles per hour, a small engine with a lot of bite. The Terriers were mostly named after places served by the London, Brighton and South Coast. The first batch all took their names from places in East and South East London: Wapping, Poplar, Fenchurch, Deptford, Shadwell and Blackwall. One of the lines these engines were built for was the East London Railway, which ran under the Thames and is now part of the Overground. Engines to be used underground were fitted with condensing equipment to minimise the amount of steam ejected in the tunnels. At the time, there was also talk of connecting the East London line to the London and Blackwall Railway, which ran from Fenchurch Street to Blackwall. Hence, well, Fenchurch and Blackwall. They were painted in a rather elaborate livery. In general, Victorian railways liked their engines to look fancy, and Stroudley was a particular fan of this policy. This was an era when labour was cheap. Cleaning engines was the first step on the ladder towards becoming a fireman and ultimately a driver. The aristocracy of the railways. The engines wore a yellow ochre colour Stroudley first used on the Highland Railway, which is known as Improved Engine Green. Now, why it's called that is something of a mystery. One theory is that Stroudley was colourblind. Another is that green was defined differently. Another is that maybe there was a minute amount of green in the mix. Another is that we've all just got the colour wrong. It is a mystery. Let's just say that it brings a whole new meaning to the name Stepney Green. Slightly less of a mystery is how they gained the nickname of Terriers. There are 3 reasons usually given. One is that they were small but fierce. Another is that their exhaust made a barking noise. And the third is that when they were introduced on the East London Railway, they spent a lot of their time diving down a hole, which was probably full of rats. Whichever explanation you like, and why not all of them, you'll almost never hear a railway enthusiast call them A1s. Oh, and they also had the nickname of routers in the early days, but that doesn't seem to have caught on quite as much. The first Terriers were successful, and so a second batch appeared in 1874. These were mostly named after South London destinations: Tooting, Hatcham, Brixton, Peckham, Clapham and Kemp Town, the odd one out. There were 5 more batches, the last coming in 1880 for a grand total of 50. As you might imagine, given the number built, they were good engines that did exactly what was asked of them. Although I can't imagine the fast acceleration was much fun for the passengers in those old four-wheeled coaches. In 1878, the engine Brighton went to the Paris exhibition, where it won a gold medal. On the way back, on the Chemin de Fer de l'Ouest, Brighton was put at the head of a train and took everyone by surprise with its turn of speed. On its return, its award-winning status was added to its paintwork. But by the end of the 19th century, the Terriers were superseded, not because they were worn out, but the traffic in the London suburbs had reached the point where they were just too small to handle it. The D-Class came in to replace them, and at the same time the company were looking into the possibility of electrification. A few Terriers were scrapped in the early years of the 20th century, but for the rest, this was only the beginning of the story. Between 1905 and 1911, the LBSC's passenger livery changed to an umber colour, and the Terriers lost their names. I will still be referring to them by their names because it's just easier than remembering a bunch of numbers. Although the LBSC considered several of the engines surplus to requirements, a number of other companies approached the London, Brighton and South Coast, saying, basically, if you don't want them, can we have them? They might have been obsolete as commuter engines, but they were perfect for branch lines, light railways and industry. Some of them wound up going through several owners. The London and South Western Railway bought Newington and Clapham in 1903 to try them out on their line to Lyme Regis. The South Eastern and Chatham Railway bought Whaddon in 1904 and produced their own answer to the Terriers in the form of the P-Class. It wasn't anything like as successful, though. In 1918, Southdown, Minories, Beulah and Earlswood were sold to the government for war service. At various times, examples got sent over to the Isle of Wight, including the aforementioned Brighton in 1902. Colonel Holman F. Stevens, master of the eccentric light railway, bought several for his lines. A couple even went to Argentina. There were various other purchases, but honestly, we'd be here all night if I talked about all of them. Companies that couldn't get hold of Terriers built their own. The South Eastern and Chatham are the most famous copycats in this regard, but they weren't the first. Dugald Drummond built the Class R for the North British Railway in 1875, which is recognisably a larger Terrier. That same year, the New South Wales Government Railways introduced the N67. Stroudley was succeeded in 1880 by R.J. Billington, who was succeeded in 1904 by D.E. Marsh. Marsh would retire in 1911, but that very same year he began a programme of rebuilding the Terriers with newer, larger boilers. The rebuilt engines were officially classed as A1X, but unofficially they were still Terriers. The engines would undergo various other modifications over their lifetimes, far too many for me to list here. Being owned by several different companies for such a long period of time, researching individual locomotives is a nightmare for historians, let alone for amateurs like me. I will mention that the examples sent to the Isle of Wight were fitted with distinctive extended bunkers to increase their coal capacity. In 1923, the LBSC was taken over by the Southern Railway. So too were the London and South Western Railway, the South Eastern and Chatham Railway, the Isle of Wight Central Railway, and just about every other public railway in the south of England. The Terriers continued doing much the same jobs they had since being demoted from commuter traffic: lightweight branch line trains, passenger or goods. When the railways were nationalised in 1948, British Railways took 21 into their stock. They gave them a power rating of 0. One of them, Morden, became a minor celebrity when it became the shunter at Brighton Works. It was painted back into improved engine green and even hauled some enthusiast specials. What did for the Terriers in the end was redundancy. As motor vehicles became more popular, branch lines and light railways began to close. In the British Railways era, many more were shut down at the recommendation of Dr. Richard Beeching. The last holdout was the Hayling Island line. The island was reached via a wooden bridge which was now in a dilapidated state and forced the closure of the railway. Engines Whitechapel, Fenchurch and Poplar hauled the last trains on the 2nd and 3rd of November 1963. And so ended the reign of Terrier. Except not quite. While the age of steam was drawing to a close, a new age was dawning. Societies were being formed up and down the country to save old locomotives from the scrap man and resurrect closed lines. No fewer than 10 Terriers made it into preservation. Stepney went to the Bluebell Railway and became a Thomas the Tank Engine character, which means he's probably the most famous member of the class. It's the most famous member of the class. He was joined by Fenchurch. Box Hill was saved for the National Railway Museum. Brighton and Newington went to the Isle of Wight Steam Railway, Newington having spent most of the 70s as a pub sign. Knowle and Poplar wound up on the Kent and East Sussex Railway. Knowle, incidentally, is the black-painted terrier you've been watching. Whitechapel is at the Spa Valley Railway at the time of filming, Martello went to Bressingham, and Whaddon went all the way to the Canadian Railway Museum. In 2022, Poplar and Fenchurch, the oldest survivors, will have their 150th birthday, and their respective owners hope to have them in steam for this milestone. These terriers still have plenty of bite left in them. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this video. If so, then please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more, if you have not already. Thanks to my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon, you are the A1X boiler to my A1. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.